Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the American Library in Paris's virtual Zoom event, another edition of Evenings with an Author featuring Lindsey Tramuta in conversation with Thomas Chatterton Williams about her latest book, The New Parisienne. I'm Catherine O'Lean, Programs Manager at the American Library. Just to say a bit about the library for those of you who are maybe joining us from the States or other places in the world and may not be familiar with us, we're an independent nonprofit institution. And so we don't receive funding from either the US or French governments. We are also the largest English language lending library on the continent, something we're very proud of. And importantly, this year we've been celebrating our centennial. So we turned 100 in May, and we've had a variety of events, most of which have taken place virtually, of course, and we'll be having our annual gala. It was postponed for October, but we'll be releasing more details about that soon. And you can stay tuned for all of our updates on our Facebook page through eLibris, which is our bi-weekly e-newsletter, or our homepage. I should also say, since it's very, very current, that we've just broken ground for our expansion. That's one of the major ways that we're celebrating our centennial as well. We're sort of refurbishing and adding a lot of space to the children's and teens section. So that's very, very exciting. And I know that there's a lot of work going on at the library as we're speaking. I should also say we're in the process of reopening, so we are open for members who would like to come in and browse. I think we've been open for about 3 weeks now, and it's all gone very well, so we're ensuring that you guys can come and get your books again. A lot of people are very eager to read after being confined for so long without them. So this evening, again, I'm delighted to be joined by Thomas, who will be interviewing Lindsey. I'll introduce him first. So Thomas Chatterton Williams is the author of Self-Portrait in Black and White, Unlearning Race, and Losing My Cool, Love, Literature, and a Black Man's Escape from the Crowd. He is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, a columnist at Harper's, and a 2019 New America Fellow. He also hosts a podcast, Americans in Paris, for the American Scholar out of our library, actually. He's also a repeat Evenings with an Author guest and moderator, so we're very happy to have him doing that again tonight. I'm just gonna let a couple more people in, sorry to multitask. And of course, we're very delighted to be joined by Lindsey Tramuta. Lindsey is also the author of the best-selling book, The New Paris, and a regular contributor to the New York Times, Condé Nast Traveler, Afar and Fortune Magazine. She's also a repeat EWA guest and panelist, and I mean, we've had her in for all sorts of events, so we're delighted to be joined by her and very happy to welcome you both. I'll hand it over to Thomas now. Thank you guys for being here.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Hi, Lindsey. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. Did you want to read a little something short first, or do you want to get right into the content?
No, I think we can get right into it, and then we'll see what time allows.
Cool. First of all, I just want to say that you publish really, really beautiful books. I love to have them in my home. I like to read them and look at them. And your first book, The New Paris, was published in 2017. It's an amazing concept. Paris is the most visited city in the world. It's a geography that we're all really familiar with. And many of us already feel we know it. Why did you sense that it was time for a reintroduction?
Well, I've been here now almost 15 years, and I think that what we notice, and I'm sure you could attest to this too, is that there are certain stories that are recycled about Paris. There are certain narratives that are common, most likely because they're part of this sort of collection of stories and fantasies that we've been seeing and we've been fed for generations. And so it's a concept and it's a formula that works. Unfortunately, I have always found that to be very limiting and very much a fraction of the full story. And so the first book was sort of an attempt to say that there are things that are happening. There is a movement of change, and there are people who are helping that change along. But it's worth focusing on because it makes a more complete, or it offers a more complete picture of what Paris is. And similarly, the new book is almost like a continuation of that. What happens when we continue to flatten a destination or flatten a whole set of people into caricature? And what does that do to our understanding of a place? What does that do to our understanding of a people? And so that kind of is what inspired the second book, which was building off the momentum of the first one and saying that there are still some problems that are worth addressing here.
Yeah, it's like a fascinating approach. You went out and you interviewed more than 50 different women from a really diverse set of backgrounds and occupations. How did you go about choosing your subjects, and how did you know, like, how did you know that 50 was enough, or not 60 or 40?
So 50 was actually my initial goal, and I quickly learned that everyone thought I was crazy because it was extremely ambitious. And, you know, you write for magazines, you know what it's like when you're approaching, you know, interviews with people, and it's basically like 50 different, you know, magazine stories in a way.
Yeah,
so
it's actually overwhelming.
So I quickly realized that I had maybe gotten myself into something that I wasn't quite prepared for, and certainly that the timing of the, you know, of the book process didn't really allow. So I incorporated, I would say, about 50 women. Not all of them are profiled, but I did want to incorporate their thoughts in some ways. But what I did was I looked at sort of my inner circle first, and there are some really inspiring, really creative and sort of forward-thinking women who are in just even my inner professional circle. And I started there, and I thought, okay, are there stories here that I should be looking at, and I should be celebrating in some way? And does this fit sort of the bigger picture of what I'm looking to do? And then it was quite easy to say, okay, there's a whole host of other women whose work I follow, whether it's in media, whether it's in, you know, the books that they write, or the, you know, articles that have been written about their work, and trying to get in touch with them to say, this is what I'm trying to do. I think you are, you know, you exemplify what I'm trying to describe, and what I'm describing is essentially more of a realistic picture of the population. And then there were women who, you know, were recommended by some of the other women I interviewed. And that's kind of the best place to be, because you know, there's who you know, and then you're introduced to a whole host of women who, you know, might have been inaccessible in some way, and through the recommendation of someone else, you know, that really helps you to build that pool of talent and ideas. And I really wanted a diversity of thought, and so this was sort of one surefire way to get that.
Yeah, I mean, you have like a real mix of some very well-known women and some that we haven't heard of yet until you've like introduced us to them. How did you go about getting Anne Hidalgo or Sarah from Colette or Leïla Slimani? Was it just a matter of approaching them and they immediately saw your vision, or?
So Anne Hidalgo took months.
It did, yeah.
She is the mayor of a very busy city, and she's become, quite honestly, probably just as solicited as, you know, the president. I mean, honestly, she is very media active, and she's got a lot of her on her plate. And unfortunately or unfortunately, I was writing this and preparing this during a time when Paris was undergoing quite a lot of upheaval, whether it was the yellow vests or, you know, floods and, you know, a whole host of other things. So it took months of chasing her team. And I think that's the thing also when you're thinking about these projects, is that yes, they're 2 years long, but the writing portion and the moment where you can actually, you know, nail these people down for time, for conversation, it all needs to happen in a certain time frame. So that's very stressful, but it worked out. And I think you just really need to persevere. And I think if I didn't have the experience of sort of chasing people for interviews, you know, as we've done, you know, we've all had to do in this field, I think it would have been, I probably would have given up. But for me, her story and her work is too important. So for me, it was like she needed to be in there. For Leïla Slimani, that was actually for a mutual friend who introduced us, who had previously interviewed her as well and made the introduction and kind of gave her like stamp of approval on what I was doing. So she was able to say, like, I know what she's going to do. I know she'll handle this with, you know, it'll be treated in a certain way, you know, talk to her, maybe see if you're willing to participate. And so that's how that happened. Other women, honestly, it was, you know, engaging with them on social media. I mean, honestly, if there's a reason to spend a lot of time on social, yes, it can be a super time suck, but it is an incredible tool to reach, especially women who are in activism. I mean, that is where they're spending a lot of their time mobilizing. And so I also needed to be, you know, in that space to be able to understand how they're working and understand how best to reach out to them. So yeah, the mix of women, you know, there are women who I think are going to become a lot more famous, women who should be more famous, and also women who for whom fame and attention is sort of irrelevant. It's about doing the work and, you know, making a difference in some way. So it might just be, you know, by showing other women that they can be part of these fields and that they have a place, or it's through, you know, being creative and just making sure that they're, you know, there's a community within Paris that embraces this kind of work.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And like, I guess we should talk a little bit about, like, what was the idea of the Parisienne, and why did it need to be updated, and in what ways has it changed, and what are we seeing now that's new and exciting? And
so I think all of us, even if you've never even been to Paris, you have some semblance of an idea of who she is. And that's thanks to pop culture and generations of stereotype building that make it very difficult for us to detach her from a certain set of qualifiers. So, you know, typically you're looking at someone who's white, heterosexual, affluent, bourgeois, so, you know, of a certain intellectual elite. Most likely, you know, she has a good job, and really she's thin. So this is another thing. The whole shape of the woman, the way she looks, has been played out and recycled over and over again. And so what I do in the book is I tried to understand, like, where did this come from, or where are some of the earliest mentions of any kind of depiction of a Parisian woman. And I look at, I trace that back to the 18th century and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his work and how he was defining women who were, yes, tied to the court, but the sort of
a Swiss guy.
I'm sorry?
A Swiss guy comes over and defines the Parisian woman for us.
Right. Well, you know, but he was also very, unamused and unimpressed by what he was seeing. And so that really tied into his work. So you're seeing women who are, you know, very obsessed with material things and superficiality, and already the identification of the French woman as, so French/Parisian, because those get conflated even now, as a sexual temptress and being, you know, excessively talented at seduction. All of that sort of started there. And when you think about how in those early, you know, literary works and how quickly they became popular and spread, those ideas become, you know, embedded in the national conversation. So that did a lot of the early work. And then that trickled down into the ways that even more modest women were described. And then you have the proliferation of prostitution, you know, structured prostitution and brothels, and how this identity then gets sort of twisted, but still connected very much to sexuality and almost the objectification of the body. And then, of course, we move on. You can look at the American GIs and how that played a role in sort of bringing some of these ideas home back to America about French women. And then in film, and branded the sort of the commodified capitalistic society that we live in. And so the reason this was so important to me is because, you know, I've lived here and yes, seen it, but I didn't move having been sort of bathed in these fantasies about what the people were like. I actually came purely as a lover of language and didn't have any expectations of what I was going to see. But I came as a 21-year-old who, you know, was in a transitional period in her life, about to become a woman, and becoming a woman and an adult woman in an environment that is very complicated. And I think it's very complicated for anybody who does not fit these, you know, this sort of checklist of qualities. And so, yes, okay, I'm a white woman from America, but there are a whole host.
You're thin. You're pretty thin.
But there are a whole host of other ways that I did not fit that mold. And so, you know, we're talking about this quality that can't necessarily be, you know, necessarily defined so neatly, but, you know, elegance and style and all of these things that have been sort of like bunched together to define this monolith. But it's not real, right? And it's not that she doesn't exist. So the people that we think about Inès de la Fressange, we think about even Jane Birkin, who's British, but has sort of like taken on the role of the adopted Parisian woman. You have Françoise Hardy, you have all of these figures. And today you'd have Jeanne Damas, who sort of perpetuates the May 1968 kind of, you know, revolutionary body. All of that's
Marion Cotillard, you've got her too.
Right. So all of this exists. You can find her, but is that the majority? No. And I almost think that, you know, these women are also capitalizing on something that they know sells. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the danger becomes, this is the sole representation we see of Parisian women, that effaces a whole massive set of the population who don't fit these characteristics, who are from immigrant families, who are of all socioeconomic strata. They are, you know, bigger, smaller, taller, maybe not able-bodied, and you never see them. And I think that just like we see this branded version of Paris that plays out, and, you know, you could call it a museum city, you could call it a postcard Paris, whatever, it's an incomplete story. And so my thing was, this is an incomplete story, and it's problematic not only for the women who live here, obviously, because they are held to this standard that they can never meet, but for all the women who look to Paris and who look to France, and they're all over the world. And that's because popular culture has told us we should be paying attention to what comes out of France. We should be reading books about how they don't get fat and how they dress better and they do everything better. And, you know, that it's preying on our sort of rampant insecurities. And then what we're seeing and what we're given is the same old recycled image. And so I do think it's very damaging, both for the place and for, you know, our sense of personal worth.
So did you get some, was there some gratitude when you started approaching Parisian women with this project? Were they happy that, like, somebody had noticed that their lives were different than this stereotype?
Totally. I mean, I think some of them were like, oh, you're right, you know, and they hadn't actually like thought about it in those terms. And then many of them actually, you know, came outright and said, you know, finally, we need to start changing this story. It's a narrative that really does very few people any real benefit. I'd say the people who are benefiting the most are the people behind the big corporations who are, you know, leveraging this image to sell billions and billions of dollars of cosmetics and clothes and ideas about Parisianness without ever really concerning themselves about who it's reflecting.
Yeah, I mean, so you get at a really fascinating discussion of multiculturalism here. Mm-hmm. Part of what makes these women new is that they are much more ethnically diverse than the traditional image would present. But diversity is done differently in France, right? What we think of as multiculturalism, what they call communautarisme, there are different values ascribed, and there's a different relation in the story they tell themselves about nationhood. I mean, can you speak a bit about how diversity is done here as opposed to back home?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reason I go into this in the book is because so many of the women in their stories talk about issues that I think needed clarification for a foreign audience. So, you know, yes, there's big discussions about race in France right now. And the context, I mean, there are certain parallels in the contexts, of course, but there are ways that these issues are treated differently. So I think what makes the French context so unique is its ideals of universalism, in which all citizens are meant to be equal under the Republic. You know, they like to believe themselves colorblind. And as a result, any emphasis on diversity, ethnicity, or race is almost seen to be, or is seen to potentially undermine unity and social cohesion. So, you know, essentially they're threats to the Republic. And that's what they would call communalism or communautarisme. So the hyphenated aspects of our identity in the United States that are seen as valuable and quite positive qualities, you know, the things that we celebrate as multiculturalism, we can celebrate that in the US, celebrate all the ways that we're different and still feel part of the national American identity, but not here. So you're seen as sort of, and if you think actually most recently about Macron and how when he commented on the Black Lives Matter / racial justice march from a few weeks ago, he didn't call them out specifically by name, but he said that any of these people who are gathering in this way are not only communautaristes, but they're separatists who are threatening to divide the nation. So
that's a strong word.
I mean, that's very, very strong language.
In America.
And so you're talking about, you know, potentially people who are from immigrant families who are born on French soil, who go to school, who identify as French, and yet the reality is they're not treated as French. So this whole idea of, universalism under the Republic is really, really great in theory, and it's a noble goal, but it falls short in practice. The other element that I would highlight is that that makes the French context quite different from the US is that it's illegal to keep racial, ethnic, or religious statistics. So without data, it becomes very difficult to measure the discriminations that exist. And we do know that they exist. So in many ways, France wields this colorblind universalism as a kind of like tool for the denial of discrimination. And then when race was removed from the Constitution in 2018, critics viewed it as further evidence of an overall, great discomfort with discussing and addressing racial injustice. So you've got this long history of slavery and colonialism that has largely been eclipsed by this narrative of universal human rights. So I know you and I have talked about this, the idea of, everyone being equal under the Republic surely sounds really wonderful in theory, but the fact that it falls short and the fact that it isn't playing out that way for a lot of people means that they don't feel like they can be part of this national community, this national identity. So what happens when the images that you're seeing on TV and in the media and the journalists who are speaking on behalf of, the collective are all white? So, I would say that in the US, again, very hard to compare, but I do think in some respects, the US has made more progress in terms of diversifying who is sharing these stories, who's getting access to tell these stories on TV and in film. And that fight is still ongoing in France. So when you're a little girl who wants to be an actress and you're Black or Arab and you see the way you're represented on television or in film, it doesn't look like a very possible or viable career path. You're presented as someone who is most likely, given the average type of, the types of stories that are often presented on television, you're probably portrayed as a caricature. A thug, potentially someone in sex work, someone who's in trouble with the law. These kinds of representations matter, and they make a big difference in people's feeling of connectedness and belonging.
Yeah, you have a really great quote early in the book where a woman says, "A woman's appearance is part of the country's source of national pride, and therefore her body belongs to the national gaze. And so if you're cut out of that, you don't participate in that pride." And so who was pushing back against this in a really interesting way that you spoke with among these women, and who taught you some things here?
Oh God, honestly, I learned so much from every single one of them. Obviously the activists are kind of the easiest people to talk to because they have so much they've already worked through and they've thought through. And even the person who said that was Alice Pfeiffer, and I learned a lot from her as well. I think we need to, what they taught me was that it's about questioning what we're seeing and questioning what we've taken for as sort of standard discourse. And that's very hard to do in this country because as a woman in general, you are not listened to as much. It's very difficult to be heard. All you have to do to see that firsthand is to see some of the women in the book who are often on television and who can barely get 10 seconds of a thought out before they're interrupted. And then you add on to that women who are of a different background, and we're talking about really trying to fight to get a seat at the table. So if we look at Rokhaya Diallo, for example, who's an activist who's very much in the spotlight, what I was sort of blown away by in speaking with her was just how much she feels French. So you can argue for the need for anti-racial movements, and you can fight for better representation and still feel, at your core that you're still part of this France. And she would say to me that there was never any moment she felt more French than when she traveled outside of France because of the way people would treat her. So one of the things that I know you and I have talked about is the experience of when you are a Black American living in France or living in Paris and what that experience is like. And then for her being a Black French woman and what the experience is like when she travels and how much she is treated like, oh, well, you're French, that's fine, you're French. but on French soil, she is everything but very clearly French. So I think, with respect to that quote about being part of the national gaze, I think, yes, I mean, you look at the symbol of the Marianne, who is the national personification of the Republic, and arguably one of the most prominent symbols of the emancipated woman, her with her breast exposed and, on stamps and statues of her everywhere. But that ideal and the way that she's been portrayed over the years by, mostly white women, has fed into all sorts of political arguments for even why the veil in religious dress is antithetical to freedom and essential Frenchness. Mm-hmm. So, talking with Sarah Zouak, who runs the organization called La Lab, which is for, giving a voice to Muslim women, speaking with Rokhaya Diallo, but a whole host of other women in the book who feel like they're just not seen. There's this, the state of being invisible is no better than being discriminated against outrightly. So there's all sorts of ways that we are discriminating against women, men and women, but in this case, speaking solely about women, and ways to feel that you're not connected to sort of the bigger community. And that does have long lasting problems. And so many of these women are working past those hurdles, working through them, working past them, whatever, and trying to, make careers for themselves. All the while, these oppressions are still very much a part of their day to day.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me how they navigate that. And it does have a lot of kind of echoes in the Black American experience, where you have James Baldwin or someone say that he never was treated as an American until he came to France, but then he saw that an African or an Arab was being treated how he would be treated back home. And so Exactly. It was a kind of complicated feeling. And I've heard others say that it's the same realization they have when they leave France and go to America, that they get to be finally just French. But I'm also interested in like your experience here. I mean, you've been in the country and in the city for long enough that you can call yourself a kind of nouvelle Parisienne. You've mastered the language, and this is really a place you've made your home. Do you feel yourself Parisian, or is it not possible to actually immigrate into Parisianness?
No, I mean, I do think, I think 10 years ago, I would have said no, because I was still holding myself to some sort of set of standards that were impossible. They're not meant for me to aspire to, or really anyone. Now, I think after doing a lot of this work and coming to the realization that I was like hoodwinked for a very long time by these very stereotypes, that I am like, first of all, I am a French citizen, and I became French in 2014, but that's even separate. It's just, this is my home. This is the city I'm devoted to. This is where I became an adult. This is where I figured out who I was. So whether I was born here or not is sort of, not irrelevant, but, plays less of a role in whether I feel Parisian. And I look at it as how New Yorkers, look at where they all come from. I mean, it is like one of the most diverse cities on the planet. And eventually they consider themselves New Yorkers. And I think that for whatever reason, we've always allowed that for New York, but in Paris, you're not really Parisian unless, you fit all these, these criteria. I don't believe that anymore. And actually the women in the book are not all born in France. They're American, they're Lebanese, they're Moroccan, they are born in, the suburbs of France, and so what it means to be Parisian needed to be rethought and upended anyway. So yeah, I would say I do feel Parisian now.
Rule of thumb in New York is 10 years, but I feel like 10 years is too short in Paris, right? Because you can't really, like, I've been here for almost 10 years, but I don't speak the language of Rabelais the way that you do. So I think that for me, it's not gonna be 10 years. What's the rule of thumb here?
I think it's you either know or you know when it hits you.
You know it when you see it. So I know I'm not a Parisian yet. I'm just an expat.
No, I know. I mean, look, also the word expat versus immigrant is a whole nother debate. I'm constantly called an expat, and I haven't used that term to refer to myself in many, many years. I mean, first of all, I have no intention of moving home. So I think that removes the expat from the equation right away. But I don't know, maybe you will find that moment where you too feel like a Parisian.
It's going to come with some real improvement in my conjugation skills, I think. I've got the knowledge of where
It's a state of mind.
restaurants are, but I don't have the conjugation skills.
It's okay.
So I love your project. I love how you have like a very holistic approach to your career. You're a writer and a journalist, but you're also a podcaster. You also have like a well-defined social media presence, and you integrate all of these things together. And even your books, they do stand alone, but they're also part of a larger like a cycle or project. So can you both speak to how you've kind of thought systematically about the investigative and kind of exploratory work you're doing in France, and also will this be a trilogy, and will the brothers get some love? The nouveau Parisiennes.
Okay, well, I'm starting with you. If there is that book, I'm starting with you. Yeah, so it's interesting because I think I came up in my career, which almost didn't feel like a career until very recently, with social media, right? So I was on Facebook when it was rolled out to my university in 2004 or whatever. And that early adoption, even with Twitter too, because I got on Twitter when I had just finished grad school and I was feeling very lost, and people were talking about Twitter, and I'm like, oh, I guess I'm going to spend some time here figuring out what this tool is. That being on those platforms early on really allowed me to get comfortable and understand how they could be used to sort of connect me to other people, but also get certain messages out there and figure out how to weave it into my work. So whatever my work was going to look like. And then of course I saw as it took off and as other platforms were introduced, and I was already comfortable playing around on those platforms, I realized that if I do have a certain message that is important to me to get out or to share, whether it's this or whether down the road it becomes something else, that these tools are ways to reach more people, but pure and simple. I mean, some of what we're discussing and what we have just discussed, finds its way into New York Times articles and investigative reports for Al Jazeera and Washington Post, but not everybody's reading those publications. And so some people are getting a lot of their learning or their news from podcasts. Some of them are spending way too much time on social media, but that's also where they're doing a lot of their learning. And so I realized that if I want to sort of get these messages into more people, then my focus cannot be on one sort of tunnel. And so I kind of attribute it to coming up at the right time when I didn't have to like catch up and learn how these platforms worked, and being a little bit more adaptable in that sense. And then also realizing that I can't put my eggs in one basket, and the nature of our work is changing. COVID has certainly thrown everything for a loop. So figuring out how I'm going to keep telling stories is sort of mutating. And so having my hand in all these different pots, I think, is a way to make sure I can, tell the stories I want to tell.
Yeah. Who's your ideal reader? Because the obvious answer would be like, I want like some young Parisian to read this and to feel seen, but maybe your ideal reader is actually not that. And it's like a 55-year-old guy who has never thought hard about some of his city's inhabitants, or I don't know.
No, you're right. I mean, I think I wanted women specifically to feel like there are other women out there who are battling the same thing and who are trying to change the stories, or the way that we are perceived, and try to change that dialogue. But I really want this to be a conversation with men too. I mean, I've gotten some messages already of men who have pre-ordered the book and who are engaged in these conversations. And I think that's honestly key. We're not going to make a lot of change if we're only having these conversations in silos and, in our little groups, or with, an all girls book club. Like, it needs to be more mainstream. And so that's who I'm hoping. I'm hoping this transcends, any tiny little niche audience group, and can be something that starts a conversation with as many people as possible. Yeah,
because it's interesting. We talked a bit about how women get spoken over here, and with that, at the risk of saying something that's too general, France is still old Latin culture, and it's interesting to compare with the United States, because on the one hand, the French government provides such a great structure that women can be mothers and also quickly get back into the workplace, and so are much more actually like liberated than American women, who often make, even highly educated American women who end up making choices between motherhood and career. But at the same time, I mean, this has been widely reported, women in France, even highly successful professional women, end up doing much more of the childcare, end up kind of still dealing with the very same things that you would think that they had transcended because they've made so much progress in other areas here. So it's a kind of fascinating conversation. It's a very timely one and very important one that you're bringing.
Well, and I think I certainly had certain notions about France early on, which was that it was a far more progressive country than it actually is. I mean, they're progressive in certain key ways, and certainly as a social system, when you're comparing it to the US, you know, it's on a whole different planet. But in terms of women's rights, it's not all golden. And if you consider even just with, you know, reproductive rights, we're still fighting right now. The bill hasn't even passed for what's called PMA, which is medically assisted procreation. It's still illegal for single women or lesbian women to have access to IVF within France.
That really shocked me when I read that, yeah.
Yeah, and so the Bioethics Committee of France has said that there's no reason it shouldn't, you know, be allowed, but it still has to be voted upon. And because of COVID and all sorts of other things, it's been delayed, you know, but these are women who, you know, who end up paying quite a lot of money to go to other countries to do this. So yes, okay, you can get contraception for free. And there are a lot of other services that are free and super accessible, and no one is judging you for in France. But then there are other areas where France actually lags quite behind. So I think ultimately there's no country that is getting it right, 100% right. You know, if they're excelling in one area, they're perhaps behind in another. But these are issues that need to be talked about. And so where I would say that these issues sort of overlap is where you have the debate around PMA, and you have men on television being the ones debating this on behalf of women. It's like, where are the women? Don't tell me that you can't find, you know, women who are directly concerned by this issue to speak. They're there. Yeah. You know, and doing a book like this tells me it doesn't take that much effort to find women to come and speak on these issues. They are there. It's the media being complicit and not wanting to change, you know, whose voices they're allowing to be heard.
Yeah, that makes, maybe this is my last question before we open it up to the audience. So America is a crazy space at the moment, and it's hard to say that America is necessarily like woke, but is France actually like a less woke, less kind of progressive space socially for women than America on balance? Is it safe to generalize like that, or is it impossible?
It's so hard. I mean, I would say, I think my gut tells me that yes. I mean, if you look at the way Me Too played out here, I mean, it almost was a non-issue.
Only Tariq Ramadan suffered any consequences. Only a Muslim man suffered any consequences.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other, you know, very heated debate. But you know, and unfortunately, in a way, it was starting to reach a fever pitch right as confinement hit. You know, we had the Roman Polanski film that was, you know, stirred all sorts of protest among women across France, and it felt very, I don't want to say exciting in a positive way, but it was exciting to see this energy, really a sustained energy, you know, carry us through over many, many months. And then, you know, obviously that's been derailed a bit, but I don't feel that France is as woke as it thinks it is. But really, is anyone? I mean, I think that's the thing, you know, every country right now is going through its sort of like learning process of how to become, you know, better and more equipped to handle these serious issues that exist. But when it comes to certain key topics in France, I think it's not even that they're blind spots, it's that they're willfully brushed under the rug. And so until that changes, we're not going to see a whole lot of woke people, especially not in the public sphere. So when it comes to race and discrimination and, you know, sexism, I still think there's a huge fight to be had and to be led.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Lindsey, thank you so much for
thank you.
These wonderful answers. And I think we must have some questions from the audience now.
Yes, thank you both. I'll invite the audience to submit your questions via the chat feature as we talked about. So go ahead and make sure your mics are still off, but I'll be happy to read any questions that come in. Give you guys a couple seconds to type, and Lindsey and Thomas can have a drink of water or relax for 30 seconds while we wait. Thank you both.
It's really a wonderful book. Bravo, Lindsey.
Thank you, Thomas.
And maybe while we're waiting too, we should just go over how to pre-order, Lindsey, or do you want to tell us a little bit about the release or?
Yeah, so it officially comes out next Tuesday, July 7th, everywhere in the world, I think. But if people want to pre-order, they can visit thenewparisienne.com. And I can actually type that in the group perhaps so that you see how it's spelled. Let me see. And if you look at Catherine's email that she sent with the details for this chat, there were some links in there as well. So that has links to the US and other countries where you can access or find the book. And so I see one question that is, should I just
we have a question from Meghan. I'm going to go ahead and read it so we can capture this in the podcast and on YouTube for people who won't be seeing this. So Meghan is saying, thank you. Do you get the sense that the feeling of being invisible as a woman in Paris is the same across France? Or are there more opportunities for women in Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, etc., where the Parisienne mystique is not there?
That's a really good question. I can't speak specifically to what it's like being a woman in those cities. However, I would say that probably what does not help is the way mostly foreign media put Parisian women in the same sort of thought as French women. So I can tell you that women who are not from Paris and who live elsewhere do not identify with being Parisian. It's kind of like if a woman from, I don't know, Los Angeles is conflated with being a New Yorker. They're different identities. There are different stories. And so I think that's one of the bigger problems. The problem is constantly creating this monolithic French woman or Parisian woman and pretending like somehow they're going to be the same all across the country. But unfortunately, I can't really speak to what it's like in terms of opportunities. I would say that most economic opportunities are in Paris and other large cities, but I would love for it to be better for women elsewhere.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've got a lot of questions. I'll do my best to get to as many as we can. The next is from Patrick. He says, how do you feel the treatment of women has changed since arriving in France till now? I guess that's since your arrival, especially interested in the workplace.
So I can speak at least to the workplace question because I did work in a corporate environment for 5-6 years. And I know that many of the sort of like offhanded remarks that I was exposed to when I was in that environment, the sort of everyday sexism that sort of filtered into casual conversation and was made to feel normalized is most likely would not pass quite so easily today. And that's really because there were certain cases actually especially in advertising and in specific companies where it was revealed that there was rampant sexism and sexual harassment, and the company needed to make a change, and so they laid off these men and actually made sort of concrete change where before they were barely reprimanded. I would say it's still a work in progress, but I know even in super conservative or traditional companies, big French, large corporations have instituted sexual harassment and sort of Me Too style guidelines and discussions and really trying to discuss the issue of consent as well. And so that already is a big step in the right direction, because before consent was, an abstract thought and didn't even really enter into the conversation. And so now it's sort of front of mind. So there have been some changes. They may seem perhaps a little bit more subtle, but things are changing.
Great, thank you. We've got a really good question from Marcia. She says, Lindsey, you touched on representation. How do you think your book will help young women seek out opportunities that they don't necessarily see themselves represented in?
I mean, I sure hope so. That was the whole reason behind including women from different professions. I wanted to have a lawyer. I wanted to have someone who's an engineer, especially in a very male-dominated aspect of engineering, women who are trying to raise millions and millions of dollars for startup projects. I think the more we see them and we hear their stories, the more we understand that it's possible. You know, I'm not in a field that's particularly masculine. However, I know that I needed to see certain stories along the way to make me feel like this wasn't just some, you know, lofty goal. So regardless, I think we all need to have these kinds of stories. And so if it helps a few young people feel like, you know, there is a way forward, then I've accomplished something.
All right, the next question is from Heather. Lindsey, do you feel French men are also subject to the cultural expectation to be seductive? And how does that influence the relationship between men and women?
Well, that's a very good question. I would assume so. I don't know that men are as, I don't know that their identities and the way that they are presented with such stereotypes are as, I don't know that they permeate sort of pop culture in the same ways or to the same degree as the stereotypes around women. I can say that, you know, the men in my life don't feel particularly hemmed in by these stereotypes. And I don't know if that's because simply they, you know, don't concern themselves with such things because, you know, it's maybe less egregious. But I would say that the dynamic between men and women and the idea of traditional gender roles and, you know, division of labor, all of those things are still very much an issue in French couples, as Thomas said, even about, you know, how you can be ascending in the workplace and still end up as a woman and still take on much of the role, much of the work at home. So I think that, you know, no, maybe they're not hemmed in by these stereotypes, but there are certain traditional roles that are not changing.
Absolutely. Okay, so Nicola is saying, as a Black American woman in France, I was horrified by Macron's response, which I haven't heard until you just stated it. Do you foresee this attitude of, quote, not challenging French unity, end quote, evolving as the US evolves and confronts its painful history and its effects?
So that's a very good question. Also, sorry, you might hear a cat meow. So that you actually raise a very interesting point, which is this idea of, oh, there's a tail. You raise an interesting point, which is sort of, you know, as America is doing this work, will that influence France? And France is very reluctant to follow another country's lead, especially not the US. And so a lot of the last 3 weeks have been, you know, French pundits going on TV and saying, you know, pointing out all the ills of US culture and sort of the US racial divide and saying, we are not like them. Let's stop trying to Americanize French politics. So I don't know. I think that there was a lot of backlash to Macron's comments about, you know, the people who are mobilizing being separatists. I think that stunned a lot of people, although it really just highlights that he's pandering quite heavily to the right. But there are more young people who are engaged and who are shocked by some of this rhetoric and who I think are going to be much more engaged and involved in a way more than they were before. So will it change? I don't know, but I do think we're not going to be so quiet about it.
All right, the next question is from Gina, who writes, have you thought of doing something in France aimed at a younger audience, so young girls and boys know that there are these Parisiennes from whom to learn?
You know what? I would love to do something like that. I have seen one sort of young adult children's book to come out recently in French with some of the women, you know, the women of color who have been influencing French society over history. So certainly I'd be excited to work on something like that for a younger audience. I think we've seen a lot of the, you know, the rebellious women, the bad women of history. I think we also need to be careful about how we're framing these kinds of stories. You know, women are not always, you know, rebellious. I mean, we can refer to them as having, you know, been disruptive and disrupted the norm, but there's a lot to be done, certainly for a young audience. I have seen a lot of very interesting children's books come out of out of France, though, that I think are trying to tackle this very topic.
Okay, great. Barbara's question is a quick one. Can we expect a version in French or a translation?
Oh, I really hope so. Apparently it's in German. The German edition came out at the end of April. again, thank you, COVID, for screwing up the timeline of that. But I would really love for this to be in French. It's not up to me. It's a publisher or publishing rights decision. A part of me worries that because of the sensitivity of some of these issues, they may opt against it. But I would hope that they see the potential in getting these stories out there, even to their own, you know, their own country. So fingers crossed, I would love for it to be translated.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for a couple more questions here. I'll go to Yvonne's. She says, how much of a role do you think language plays in racial discrimination in France? Are certain dialects in French harshly judged? In other words, is code switching as prevalent in France as in the US?
Probably. I mean, again, I can't speak from my from personal experience, but I would imagine there's, you know, sort of like, you know, switching identities as you go through different contexts here in French society, especially given how elitist it tends to be. When you think about the people who are, you know, allowed to represent France, it's based on how palatable they are to sort of like, you know, the white national identity. So I do think that plays a role. And, you know, language, regardless of the culture, is one way for people to be judged. But from personal experience, I haven't necessarily felt that, although even just purely as someone who is not a native French speaker, I have felt, you know, sort of uneasy in certain situations because I knew that I was being judged based on that and based on my ability to express a certain idea. So you can only imagine how that might play out if you're, you know, speaking a dialect or you're from a, you know, West African French speaking or Francophone culture, where there are differences in terminology and phrases. And, you know, the French are just, they're just very judgy of everyone. And so I do think that plays out, you know, for someone who, you know, isn't a native French speaker and for someone who speaks, you know, a dialect or even Quebecois. I mean, they're highly judged when they come to France and speak. So I'm sure that plays a role.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah's question is, how difficult is it for French women, especially those of non-stereotype backgrounds, to obtain private investment for building companies?
How difficult is it for French women? It's tough. I mean, so the funding exists, but one of the women in the book, who's named Anne Ravenona and has a company called Global Investor, talks about the funding gap for women. So across the board, and this is true in France, but also around, you know, an issue elsewhere in Europe, just the access to funding is very, very difficult, partially because when women in general undervalue the amount of money that they need, they're afraid to ask for more, and men tend to overestimate the amount of money that they need. But in terms of, so that would be private investment. Government aid is readily available. So you know, luckily that doesn't seem to be as much of a problem. It's about how do we unlearn some of these unconscious biases that make men less likely to invest in women-funded or women's businesses, and how do women get the confidence to ask for what they deserve and what they need.
Okay, great, thank you. We'll take one last one here from Liz. If there are no statistics taken based on ethnicity, how do women in France define themselves? Is there an emphasis on correctly identifying people, such as there is at least growing in the US? How does the French woman define herself versus how does society define her in terms of pronouns, etc.?
I don't think we are yet to the point as we are in the US where we've just seen, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that acronym come out, which has also been heavily debated in the US. There have been stories just this week from people of color who disagree with using that term. You know, I don't know. I think there are in my friend group here, there are women who would refer to themselves as queer. They would refer to themselves as, you know, Black, white, Muslim. I mean, honestly, I think there's less labeling because they're resisting the overarching culture of putting people in boxes and labeling them. So I think they're more likely to say, bah, je suis une femme, voilà, je suis une femme noire, ou je suis une femme tout court, and that's it. But I don't get the sense that there is this sort of like heightened political correctness around the pronouns and the terms. It's starting, but I don't think it's, you know, it doesn't take off like it does in the US, which happened like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, well, we're just about coming up to time here, so I wanted to thank Thomas and Lindsey again so much. Thank you also for asking all of those wonderful questions, and Lindsey for your responses. And before I let you all go, I just wanted to give a little bit of a preview of the upcoming Evenings with an Author events that we have. So our season does wrap up pretty soon. It wraps up on July 15th. And if you're curious about the upcoming events, you can check out our homepage to learn more. But just to highlight a couple, on the 7th of July, we'll be hosting Alice Jardine and Lauren Wolfe speaking on Julia Kristeva. On the 8th of July, we'll be hosting Alex Beam, who's going to speak on Mies van der Rohe, Edith Farnsworth and the Farnsworth House in Illinois. And on the 9th of July, so this opportunity is only open to library members, but I'll mention it anyway just to tempt you guys, to inspire you to possibly become members. We have a writing workshop with Anissa Bouziane, and it's all about writing our way out of confinement. So thank you guys so much for being here. You can check out our past events as well on YouTube or our podcast, Evenings with an Author podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you like to get your podcasts. And really quickly, I should also mention, since we are a nonprofit, we do welcome donations. You'll find that link in the email I sent out. If you're interested in learning more about supporting the library, please do visit that site. So thank you all for being here again. And thank you, Lindsey. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. Thanks.